RUSI New South Wales is an independent, apolitical, not-for-profit public education institute that, since 1888, has been promoting informed debate on and enhancing public awareness and understanding of defence and national security issues. We are Australia's oldest think tank. We conduct monthly lectures and seminars, issue a monthly newsletter, provide research support through our extensive military and historical library located in the Anzac Memorial in Sydney's Hyde Park, and together with RUSI Australia, publish a national quarterly magazine called United Service, with informed articles addressing the latest defence and security issues.
Please note, this monthly update presents the geostrategic situation as at the 10th of February, 2025. As often with these rapidly changing events, the monthly update can be out of date by the time the podcast is published. The start to 2025 geostrategically has been dominated by a temporary truce and hostage prisoner exchange in Gaza, and the inauguration of Donald J. Trump as President of the United States for a second term, including the executive actions that he immediately took and the disruption of the international order that he caused. The wars in Ukraine, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Myanmar and elsewhere, however, while pushed off the front pages, nevertheless have continued unabated. David Leese will attempt to succinctly summarize the more significant issues that have attracted his attention. United States. President Donald J. Trump's 2024 presidential election victory was certified by a joint sitting of the United States, U.S., Congress on the 6th of January, 2025, and he was inaugurated in Washington, D.C., on the 20th of January. In the lead-up to his inauguration, Trump had flagged a proposed major change in U.S. foreign policy. Seemingly prepared to ditch the U.S. post-World War II approach to international affairs based on a rules-based order, coupled with alliances and partnerships with like-minded nation-states, he proposed that the U.S. should go it alone to ensure its security. To this end, he wants to expand U.S. territory to incorporate other territories vital to U.S. security. Buy Greenland from Denmark, or seize it by military force. Annex Canada using economic force to incorporate Canada into the Union, making it the 51st state. Invade Panama to retake control of the Panama Canal, and rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. Not surprisingly, the governments of the target territories and their allies told Trump that he was dreaming, but that did not seem to deter him. He has emphasized that he is prepared to use economic coercion or military force if necessary to achieve his goals. On taking office, Trump issued a series of executive orders and related actions over subsequent days. Trump threatened Denmark that he would impose punishing tariffs on their imports to the U.S. if they did not sell Greenland, but none have eventuated to date. He imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican imports, but after negotiations with both nations on border control issues, suspended it for 1 month on the cusp of its implementation. As the border issues with Canada were inconsequential, the tariffs in Canada's case were widely seen as punishment for refusing to become the 51st state. He imposed a 10% additional tariff on Chinese imports, following which China retaliated in kind. A US-China trade war appears to be in prospect. Google Maps announced that it would rename the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America within the US, but not within Mexico, and would use both names outside the US and Mexico. Trump also banned all funding to the main United Nations, UN, Relief Agency for Palestinians, UNRWA, suspended the work of the U.S. Overseas Development Agency, USAID, disengaged from the UN Human Rights Council, cancelled U.S. membership of the World Health Organization, although that will take 12 months to come into effect, and imposed sanctions on the members and staff of the International Criminal Court over the ICC's investigations of Israel, a close U.S. ally. On the 25th of January, Trump released a shipment of -84 Malawian Kwacha's 1,000-kilo bombs to Israel, which had been held up, paused by the Biden administration since May 2024 to discourage Israeli breaches of humanitarian law in Rafah, Gaza. On the 5th of February, after hosting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House, Trump proposed that Gaza become a U.S. territory to be redeveloped as the Riviera of the Middle East. On the 7th of February, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said Donald Trump is supportive of the AUKUS alliance, after Australia sent a $500 million $798 million Australian dollars payment to Washington under the AUKUS agreement. This is the first of several payments to assist the U.S. submarine building industry, which will need to produce submarines in excess of America's own needs before Australia will be able to buy any as planned in the 2030s. There is no disputing the strategic value of Greenland to the United States, which first tried to purchase it from Denmark in 1868 following the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867. In 1951, the Truman administration again offered to buy Greenland from Denmark. In a compromise, the U.S. was given an air base at Thule, now the Pitofik Space Base, 1,200 kilometers inside the Arctic Circle. The territory's strategic location and mineral wealth are being enhanced today by climate change. There are now longer periods of ice-free maritime trade routes providing faster alternative routes from Europe to North Asia, avoiding strategic choke points such as the Suez Canal and Straits of Malacca. Climate change is also making mining access much easier to Greenland's wealth in strategically valuable lithium, other rare earths and heavy metals used in 21st century defense and electronic applications, including batteries, energy storage and electric vehicles. China and Russia, among others, are positioning to avail themselves of these benefits of climate change. The United States wishes to as well. The Danish Prime Minister, Ms. Mette Frederiksen, so far has withstood Trump's heavy-handedness. She insisted on the 3rd of February that Greenland is not for sale and called for a robust response from her European Union partners should Trump press ahead with his threat to take control of the island. The suspension of the work of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, while a review is undertaken by the U.S. Department of State, will have major impacts on those who are the intended beneficiaries of the projects currently underway, as well as the army of professionals throughout the Global South and elsewhere who are delivering those projects. That said, the principles enunciated in the U.S. Department of State media release on implementing President Trump's executive order on foreign aid are unexceptional, but are unhelpful as a guide to how they may be interpreted by the review. Should Trump's antipathy towards USAID primarily inform that interpretation, then the U.S. foreign aid program, as we have known it since 1961, will be in deep trouble. One consequence of such an outcome, at the geostrategic level, would be to create an aid vacuum in Third World, Global South countries that China would be both well-placed and very keen to fill. That, in turn, has significant implications for geostrategic competition between the United States and China, not least in Australia's backyard, the South Pacific. This is an example of the chaos created globally by Trump's executive orders. We will await the outcome of the USAID review with interest and not a little trepidation. Russia-Ukraine war. The principal development of geostrategic import affecting the war in Ukraine over the past month has continued to be Donald J. Trump's decisive victory in the United States presidential elections on the 5th of November. With both Russia and Ukraine nearly exhausted after nigh on 3 years, 35 months, of high-end warfare, the focus of each side has been on improving its negotiating position for the peace talks which must now follow. Political developments. On several occasions during the U.S. presidential election campaign, Trump pledged to end the Russia-Ukraine war within 24 hours of him assuming office. Trump's chosen special peace envoy for Ukraine, retired Army General Keith Kellogg, conceded on the 11th of January that would not be possible. Rather, Trump would now aim to end the war within 100 days of re-entering the White House. That timeframe also appears tight now that Trump has assumed office. Administration officials are speaking in terms of within 6 months. On the 19th of December, Russian Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov and his assistant were assassinated in Moscow not far from the Kremlin. Ukraine's Secret Service, the SBU, claimed responsibility. On the 4th of February, a Ukrainian pro-Russian military leader, Armen Sarkisyan, was killed in a bomb explosion at a luxury apartment block in Moscow. Russian investigators described it as a carefully planned assassination. Again, the Ukrainian SBU is suspected of being behind the assassination. On the 10th of January, the United States, United Kingdom, and Japan announced new sanctions against Russia. On the 10th of January, the Kremlin reiterated that it is ready to hold talks with U.S. President-elect Donald Trump without any preconditions, but noted that its negotiating position remains unchanged. It demands that Ukraine not become a member of NATO, and that Crimea and the 4 Ukrainian provinces it now partially occupies, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, be incorporated into Russia. For its part, Ukraine wishes to return to its international pre-war borders and receive a guarantee from its Western allies of security from future Russian attacks, membership of NATO being the obvious vehicle by which to realize this ambition. On the 9th of February, it was announced that Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania have disconnected their electricity systems from Russia's power grid as part of a plan designed both to block Russia's ability to geopolitically blackmail them via the electricity system, and also to further integrate with the European Union and boost security. Ukraine's Kursk offensive. You will recall that, on the 6th of August, Ukraine launched a successful cross-border incursion from Sumy Oblast in Ukraine's northeast into Kursk Oblast in Russia's west, catching Russia by surprise. By the time the offensive culminated in September, Ukraine claimed to have pushed 28 to 35 kilometers into Kursk Oblast on a front at least 40 kilometers wide, and to have captured some 1,263 square kilometers of Russian territory, including 93 settlements. President Volodymyr Zelensky said the Kursk operation was intended to create a buffer zone at the border to prevent further Russian attacks across the border into Sumy Oblast. The Kremlin, though, suspected that Zelensky would seek to use the Kursk salient as a bargaining chip in any negotiations, say to exchange Kursk for Crimea. To obviate this, President Putin assembled a force of 30,000 troops, including some 11,000 North Koreans, and launched a counteroffensive in October to drive the Ukrainian forces out of Kursk Oblast. In response, Ukraine launched its own counteroffensive within the salient in December. The net effect of the fierce fighting over the last 4 months has been that the Russian-Korean force has managed to reduce the size of the Ukrainian salient to about half of its original size. Casualties, inevitably, have been heavy on both sides, but especially among the Koreans, whom Ukrainian reports indicate have now been withdrawn from the front line. In early February, Russian forces were making further inroads into the Ukrainian salient northwest, west and southeast of Sudzha, the city in the center of the salient. Ukrainian forces were counterattacking in the southeast, where the Russian gains posed a threat to the Ukrainian rear. Russia's Donbass and Zaporizhia offensives. Russia retains the upper hand in the fighting in eastern and southern Ukraine, where fighting has continued this year, albeit more constrained by the climatic conditions, over the usually quiet winter period. Russian forces have been employing mechanized forces on hard icy ground, and dismounted infantry, supported by artillery and drones, on soft mushy terrain. The outnumbered Ukrainians have held the cities tenaciously, but the Russians have slowly advanced through the countryside, village by village, outmaneuvering and surrounding the Ukrainian-held cities, eventually forcing Ukrainian withdrawals. Both sides are modifying their tactics as they gain battlefield experience with drones, but are doing so quite differently. The Ukrainians are integrating drone operations with ground operations, whereas the Russians are centralizing their drone units. Russia has also taken advantage of the winter period to redeploy some forces apparently in preparation for a new spring offensive in the east to capture the remainder of the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, before any ceasefire comes into effect. As to the terrain now held in the east, most of Luhansk Oblast is in Russian hands and the western boundary of the Luhansk front is now pushing into Kharkiv Oblast in places. Key western Luhansk cities now in Russian hands include Kupiansk, Svatov, and Kreminna. Perhaps three-quarters of Donetsk Oblast also is now in Russian hands, including Bakhmut, Horlivka, Chasiv, Toretsk, Kurakov, Vuhledar, and Velika Novosilka. Kramatorsk and Pokrovsk are still held by Ukraine, but Pokrovsk is being pressed closely from the south where Russian forces made major tactical gains in December-January and executed a turning maneuver to directly assault Pokrovsk from the south. In southern Ukraine over the past month, Russian forces have focused on maintaining their frontline positions and secure rear areas against Ukrainian strikes. There has been continued positional fighting, but no gains of tactical significance by either side. Earlier, in December-January, a Russia offensive in western Zaporizhia Oblast north of Robotyne made slow but steady progress towards the Dnipro River and Zaporizhia city without seizing any operationally significant objectives. Drone and missile attacks. Russia's drone, missile and bombing attacks on Ukrainian cities, some striking militarily significant targets such as energy plants, others apparently targeting civilians, have continued unabated during the past month. In recent days, these strikes focused on the strategic Black Sea port of Odessa, vital for the export of Ukrainian grain. During recent months, Ukraine has escalated its missile and drone attacks on targets inside Russia, particularly after the 18th of November, 2024, when the US gave Ukraine permission to use US-supplied long-range missiles to strike military targets in Russian areas close to the two countries' shared border. These strikes have been primarily in support of the ground operations in eastern Ukraine and Kursk Oblast and have targeted troop concentrations, airfields, logistics facilities and the like. Ukraine also has continued its longer-range strategic campaign using its own missiles and drones to target oil refineries and defense industries, some deep within Russia. Middle East conflicts. Gaza. Gaza has dominated the news over the past month. First, a temporary ceasefire was finally negotiated between Israel and Hamas and came into effect on the 19th of January, and second, on the 5th of February, President Trump announced his post-war plans for Gaza, the latter throwing negotiations for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza into turmoil. On the 15th of January, 2025, the negotiations for a temporary ceasefire were concluded in Doha under the auspices of Qatar, Egypt and the United States, after some fine-tuning of the plan presented to the parties by the Biden administration in May 2024. The plan provides for a hostage and prisoner exchange leading to a permanent armistice implemented in 3 stages. Stage 1, scheduled to last 6 weeks, 42 days, involves the release of 33 Israeli hostages, the majority children and women, held by Hamas in exchange for the release by Israel of several hundred Palestinian prisoners and detainees, 30 to 50 Palestinians for each Israeli hostage released, the withdrawal of Israeli forces to the borders of Gaza, including from the Netzarim corridor, which divides northern Gaza from southern Gaza, so as to enable Gazan citizens to return to their homes, the provision of sufficient food and humanitarian aid to the Gaza citizenry, and talks between the two parties on a more permanent cessation of hostilities, including finalization of plans for implementation of Stage 2. Stage 2 is less precisely defined. It provides for Israel to accept a permanent ceasefire, including the withdrawal of the IDF from Gaza, the return by Hamas of all remaining live Israeli hostages, both civilians and soldiers, in exchange for further Palestinian prisoners and detainees, and the development of plans for Stage 3. Stage 3 provides for the return by Hamas of the remains of deceased Israeli hostages in exchange for a further release of Palestinian prisoners and detainees held by Israel, and the rebuilding of Gaza over a 3 to 5 year period. Up until the temporary truce came into effect on the 19th of January, the war in Gaza had continued apace. Palestinian groups had continued to conduct asymmetric warfare in the cities, particularly in northern Gaza, while Israel continued its attempts to destroy Hamas and other Islamic militant groups before the ceasefire came into effect. By the 10th of February, it was evident that Hamas was far from defeated and was still very much in control of Gaza. Since the temporary ceasefire came into effect on the 19th of January and up to the 10th of February, Stage 1 of the agreement had been largely complied with by both sides, although there was little, if any, trust between the two parties. The prisoner exchanges had occurred as scheduled, notwithstanding that some exchange deadlines were missed initially by both sides. 16 hostages had been released, but it did not help that 3 hostages released on the 8th of February were emaciated, fueling anger across Israel and in the international community. Israel had breached the ceasefire several times, killing 28 Palestinians in Gaza but, as required, had begun withdrawing its troops from the Netzarim corridor. 17 further hostages, 8 of whom are believed to be dead, were due for release over the remaining 19 days of Stage 1, which concludes on the 2nd of March. The scheduled Stage 1 negotiations on a lasting peace in Gaza began on the 7th of February, but by the 10th of February had made little, if any, progress. President Trump's announcement on the 5th of February of his vision for a post-war Gaza has not assisted. Nor has Prime Minister Netanyahu's comment in the same press conference that Israel now would end the war by winning the war. Trump envisages the Palestinian residents of Gaza being permanently moved from Gaza to new, purpose-built settlements in Jordan and Egypt. Once Gaza had been depopulated, America would take over the Gaza Strip, remediate the territory, and then develop it as a resort for the international community, a Riviera of the Middle East. This vision was immediately rejected by the Egyptians, Jordanians, Palestinians and Saudi Arabia, as well as much of the international community. Trump, however, was not deterred and could use aid funding and trade sanctions in support of his suasion efforts, should he so choose. That said, given the current turmoil in the negotiations, a seamless transition from the Stage 1 temporary ceasefire to the Stage 2 permanent ceasefire, and return of remaining living hostages to Israel on or shortly after the 3rd of March for which many had hoped, appears now to be very doubtful. The West Bank. Beginning on the 21st of January, the IDF took advantage of the ceasefire in Gaza, which came into effect on the 19th of January, to tackle Palestinian insurgents on the West Bank. It conducted raids across the occupied territory. Its main target was Jenin City, its refugee camp, and surrounding towns. It killed 25 Palestinians, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. Israeli forces reinforced their presence around the refugee camp, conducted intensive drone surveillance, and demolished residential blocks in Jenin. The army also continued to besiege Jenin Governmental Hospital. Nearly 90% of the camp's population was forcibly displaced, with many seeking refuge in 39 villages and towns across Jenin Governorate. Elsewhere, Israeli forces stormed several areas in the Ramallah Governorate and assaulted and detained 2 Palestinians in the old city of Hebron as they were distributing bread. In Beitar, south of Nablus, Israeli forces assaulted ambulance crews during a raid, wounding a paramedic. The IDF also continued its wide-scale assault on Tulkarm city and its refugee camp, causing extensive damage to infrastructure and civilian property. Dozens of Palestinians were arrested, hundreds of families were forced to flee their homes, and 4 Palestinians were killed, including a child and a journalist. The IDF carried out mass arrests in eastern Tulkarm city and turned Palestinian homes in Tulkarm and its camp into military outposts after evicting their residents. These operations were still underway on the 7th of February. Lebanon. The ceasefire agreement signed on the 27th of November, 2024 between Israel and Lebanon, with 5 countries, including France and the US, mediating, provided for Hezbollah to withdraw its forces to north of the Litani River and Israel to withdraw its forces from southern Lebanon within 60 days, i.e. by the 26th of January, 2025. The Lebanese army was to deploy 5,000 troops in the buffer zone so created to ensure compliance. During that 60-day period, the ceasefire was quite shaky at times. France reported on the 2nd of December that Israel had violated the ceasefire 52 times, but overall the ceasefire appeared to be holding. There were strikes by the IDF on suspected Hezbollah positions in the buffer zone, whether in self-defense or designed to hasten the Hezbollah withdrawal, or both is unclear, but a number of Lebanese civilians were killed, most in the first month of the ceasefire. In part, this was a consequence of the Lebanese army being slow to replace the IDF in the border area, which the Lebanese army said would be difficult to achieve until the IDF completed its withdrawal. In part, the IDF withdrawal had been slower than intended as it decided to destroy some of the remaining Hezbollah infrastructure as it withdrew. The IDF withdrawal was not fully completed by the 26th of January, so the US extended the withdrawal period until the 18th of February. There were IDF attacks in South Lebanon again on 26 to 27 January, as internally displaced civilians attempted to return home when they thought the IDF withdrawal would have been completed. At least 29 people were killed and 100 injured according to the Lebanese Health Ministry. It is unclear whether the IDF suspected there were Hezbollah operatives among the returnees. The Bekaa Valley in eastern Lebanon traditionally has been a center of Hezbollah influence. On the 31st of January and the 8th of February, Israeli airstrikes there killed another 8 people and injured 12. Significantly, Hezbollah's influence in the government of Lebanon has declined commensurate with its losses, especially of senior civilian and military leaders, and also with the decline in the regional standing of its patron, Iran, following its recent conflict with Israel. Many analysts consider that Hezbollah's acquiescence to the ceasefire agreement and to Israel's violations of it from time to time are signs that Hezbollah has been desperate to stop the war. Syria. As I reported last month, Syria's new de facto leader is Ahmed al-Sharaa, leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, the militant Islamic group, which spearheaded the overthrow of the Assad regime in early December. Since the overthrow of Assad, rallies in Damascus have called for democracy, protection of women's rights, and a secular government. Sharaa announced on the 30th of December that it may take up to a year before Syrians begin to see drastic changes in their country, up to 3 years to draft a new constitution for Syria, and up to 4 years before elections can be held. Since taking national office, Sharaa has been presenting a moderate face to the world and has been attempting to reassure neighboring countries that are concerned about the new regime's militant Islamist past. His message has been that the new regime will not work on exporting the revolution. Rather, Damascus will seek to establish strategic relations with all regional states. Sharaa has now met with Turkey's president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and Qatar's emir, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. Sharaa said his priorities were to protect Syria's territorial integrity, unite rival factions in a national army, create an inclusive, elected administration, and rebuild after 13 years of civil war. Simon Tisdall, in The Guardian on the 9th of February, commented that, "The task is enormous, Sharaa is inexperienced. Some doubt he has abandoned his radical roots. Yet, lacking good alternatives, helping him is a gamble regional leaders have to take." Meanwhile, Israel has taken the opportunity created by the turmoil in Syria to seize more Syrian territory. It has occupied the Golan Heights since the 1967 Six-Day War and formally annexed the area in 1981. A 1974 agreement established a wide buffer zone along the eastern flank of the Golan separating Israeli and Syrian forces. Israel has now occupied that buffer zone and has advanced further into Syria, expanding this newly occupied zone. Israel also has bombed several hundred targets across Syria, which Israel believes have been used by Iranian-backed militia for activities inimical to Israel's interests. Yemen. The Houthi rebels appear to have suspended their activities against shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden since the temporary ceasefire came into effect in Gaza on the 19th of January. They have made clear, however, that the anti-shipping campaign will resume should the fighting in Gaza recommence. On the 22nd of January, the Houthis released the crew of the Galaxy Leader, a car carrier they seized in the Red Sea on the 19th of November, 2023 due to its Israeli links. Sudan. Rather than repeat the detailed account of this conflict that I have provided in recent geostrategic summaries, I will share with you a concise summary published by the International Crisis Group on the 30th of January. Sudan's ruinous civil war rages on with no end in sight. The conflict that began in April 2023 is causing untold human misery, with tens of thousands killed and millions uprooted from their homes. Famine was declared in North Darfur in August 2024, and the UN has warned that the hunger crisis could be one of the worst in modern history. Sudan is increasingly divided into zones of control, with one of the main belligerents, the Sudanese army, holding the north and most parts of the east, while the other, the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, dominate the western regions of Darfur and Kordofan. The capital, Khartoum, remains a war zone, mostly under the RSF's sway, though the army is regaining ground. Despite a resurgence for the army, which took back Wad Medani, capital of the Jazeera state and an agricultural and trading hub, in early January, and much of Greater Khartoum late in the month, neither side appears able to achieve victory. That means the war could drag on even longer, destabilizing neighboring countries and exacting an ever greater toll on the Sudanese people. Outside powers, particularly the United Arab Emirates (UAE), the RSF's chief backer, and Egypt, which supports the army, are fueling the hostilities. Diplomatic efforts to end the war have not been equal to the moment. Attempts to foster talks between the two warring parties have mostly stumbled just past the starting line. A crucial problem has been the failure of external players to push their allies toward serious negotiations. Western powers, including the US, have sought to organize new talks, but with little success. The latest actor to take up the mediation mantle, Turkey, will need help to make progress where others have faltered.
This strategic update was produced by David Leese, Chair of the RUSI New South Wales Special Interest Group on Strategy. The SIG Strategy Group seeks to enhance knowledge of strategy, including the evolution of strategic thought, maintain awareness of current geostrategic issues, and undertake research on nominated issues of current strategic interest.